The hall shimmered with golden light, every chandelier above the gala crowd glistening like 1,000 eyes watching from the heavens. This was the annual Global Women in Media Awards in New York City, and the room was brimming with A-list journalists, Hollywood icons, and political heavyweights. Laughter mixed with the soft clink of glasses as guests mingled over foie gras and polished ambition. Among them stood Meryl Whitmore, a towering presence in a flowing burgundy gown, her silver-streaked hair gathered into a regal knot. She had ruled television for 3 decades, known for her fierce interviews and progressive opinions. Tonight, she was receiving the Lifetime Influence Award, and she knew it. Her smile was poised, her words measured, but her confidence carried the weight of someone who believed this was her room. Karoline Levitt entered quietly. She wore a sleek navy dress, simple, sharp, and deliberate. The subtle glint of a silver cross rested against her collarbone. Not flashy, just present. Her blonde hair framed a calm yet assertive expression. Though only 27, she had already served as the youngest White House press secretary in history and had recently launched a new media initiative focused on faith, freedom, and conservative values. She wasn't here for applause. She was here to represent a rising voice, one that often made rooms like this uncomfortable. "Karoline?" a reporter from the Post whispered, eyes wide. "What's she doing here?" "She's presenting one of the awards," another answered, clearly annoyed. Backstage, an assistant handed Karoline her cue card. She was set to introduce an up-and-coming documentary filmmaker, someone who had highlighted the overlooked voices of working-class women in Appalachia. It should have been a moment of shared celebration, but when Meryl spotted Karoline across the room, her smirk shifted, subtly, into a storm brewing. As Karoline walked to the podium, a silence rolled over the room, polite yet taut. Meryl sat in the front row, arms crossed, an eyebrow slightly arched. Karoline began, her voice composed and sincere. "Tonight, we honor not only the stories told in comfortable circles, but also those told from coal towns, small churches, and kitchen tables that never make it into elite headlines." The applause was scattered, some clapping warmly, others hesitating. Meryl's smirk returned. When the time came for her acceptance speech, she stood with queenly grace and moved to the microphone, giving Karoline a passing glance that held just a flicker of disdain. "Thank you," Meryl began, "for this recognition of truth-telling in media. Though today, truth seems selective, especially when it's spun by little girls with big microphones." The crowd laughed. Not all, but enough for the echo to sting. Karoline didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on Meryl's, and though she remained seated, the story was only just beginning. A few uneasy laughs rippled across the ballroom, but the tension hung in the air like humidity before a summer storm. Karoline's name wasn't spoken outright, but everyone knew who Meryl had meant. Little girls with big microphones. It stung, and it was meant to. Meryl, with her decades of media dominance, had just drawn the first line in the sand. Her delivery was velvet-wrapped steel, polished and casual, but the intent behind it was sharp as a knife. Karoline didn't blink. She sat back in her chair, her fingers brushing lightly against the silver cross at her collar. She'd faced worse, shouting reporters, ambush panels, viral smears. But what made this moment different was the smirking approval on many of the faces around her. These were the same people who claimed to champion women's voices, just not hers. Meryl continued her speech, speaking of truth and values, and the duty of media to confront lies, no matter who wears the suit and tie. A few heads turned toward Karoline as if on cue. She smiled faintly, not amused, not defensive, just focused. She didn't interrupt. She listened. When the speech ended, Meryl received a standing ovation. Karoline clapped politely but briefly, then stood as the host approached her backstage. "She went in," the host whispered with a wince. "You okay?" Karoline nodded. "I've been underestimated before." Backstage, her phone buzzed. A dozen texts from friends and conservative colleagues. "She just called you out. Want us to respond?" She poked the wrong person. "Let us post something." But Karoline didn't answer. Not yet. 10 minutes later, The host returned to the stage to begin a panel discussion titled Voices Across America, Media in a Divided Nation. To the surprise of the audience, the panel had been adjusted. Meryl and Karoline were now both listed. As the two women walked onto the stage and sat opposite one another, the energy in the room shifted palpably. Meryl still held the room's favor, but Karoline held something else: readiness. The moderator cleared her throat. Let's begin with the topic of generational responsibility in media. Miss Levitt, would you like to start? Karoline took the mic with calm confidence. Sure, she said, eyes locking on Meryl. Tonight we've heard a lot about truth, but truth doesn't belong to one generation, and it's not earned by airtime or awards. It's something you stand for, even when it's unpopular. Especially then. The crowd grew quiet. Karoline wasn't here to yell. She was here to challenge. I may be young, she added, but I don't need a media empire behind me to know the difference between real journalism and narrative control. Meryl leaned back, lips pursed. The audience wasn't sure whether to cheer or wait, but one thing was certain. Karoline had just taken her first step to flipping the room. Meryl adjusted the microphone in front of her, her smile still composed, but now tinged with tension. Miss Levitt, she said, her voice smooth, I appreciate your enthusiasm. But truth, real truth, takes time, experience, and context. It's not about who speaks the loudest or fastest on social media. A polite laugh spread across the crowd. Meryl's fans leaned in, reassured by her trademark poise. She had spent decades commanding stages and headlines. She wasn't about to be shaken by a young press secretary with a silver cross and sharp words. But Karoline wasn't looking for a laugh. She was looking for something much deeper. She leaned forward slightly, hands folded neatly on the table. Miss Streep, she said, her tone respectful but piercing, you've earned your seat through performance. I've earned mine through policy, crises, and accountability. You tell stories. I face the real ones every day. There's a difference. The room shifted again. Silence. And then murmurs. Karoline didn't let the moment slide. She continued. You said this country needs people who challenge lies. I agree. That's why I speak out. But challenging doesn't mean mocking. It doesn't mean calling someone a little girl in front of a national audience and then claiming moral high ground. Meryl's eyes narrowed. I'm not a child, Karoline added, her voice steady. I represent millions who've been dismissed the same way. People who are told they're too young, too religious, too conservative to be taken seriously, but we don't back down, not anymore. The moderator stepped in, sensing the stakes rising. Let's refocus on the role of the press. But the audience wasn't listening to the moderator. Their eyes were fixed on the two women, now locked in a subtle, high-stakes standoff. Karoline had done more than just respond. She had exposed the subtext beneath Meryl's jab and flipped it into a rallying cry. Backstage, social media erupted. The clip of Karoline saying, "You tell stories. I face the real ones," had already been clipped, captioned, and uploaded by 3 political accounts, one of which had 2.3 million followers. The caption read, "The moment Karoline Levitt silenced Hollywood's loudest voice." And they were just getting started. As the auditorium swelled with murmurs, Meryl shifted in her seat. Her polished composure strained beneath the weight of Karoline's words. She leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly as if recalibrating. For decades, she had held the room with presence alone. But Karoline had shifted that power with one sentence, and Meryl knew it. "Miss Levitt," she began, voice lower now, less performative, more deliberate. "You talk about representing millions, but representation comes with responsibility. Inflaming division is not leadership. Stoking outrage is not truth." Karoline didn't blink. Her eyes stayed locked, unwavering. "With respect," she said, tone calm but unmistakably assertive. "Division doesn't come from telling the truth. It comes from silencing people for saying it. You talk about responsibility, but what about accountability? You used your stage to humiliate, not to heal. And when someone pushes back, suddenly it's called outrage?" A few in the crowd gasped, Others clapped. The line struck like a bell, clean, resonant, undeniable. Meryl smiled tightly. "If we want unity," she replied, "we must rise above petty insults and political points." Karoline leaned forward again, this time her voice softer, but even more piercing. "You called me a little girl in front of the world. That wasn't unity. That wasn't rising above. That was you reminding everyone that you thought I didn't belong here. But I do." That sentence landed with a force no one expected. The room went still. No movement, no whispers. Just the ticking silence of a crowd caught between discomfort and awe. Meryl opened her mouth to respond, but Karoline wasn't finished. "You see, I've sat in situation rooms with President Trump while the media spun chaos. I've answered calls from families whose sons didn't come back from overseas. I've stood before reporters who tried to twist every word into a weapon. I've earned these scars. So forgive me if I don't crumble under a Hollywood monologue." The audience erupted, some clapping, others stunned into silence. Meryl's expression shifted, not to anger but to something harder to define. Recognition? Resignation? In the back row, a young woman clutched her phone, texting her sister, "Karoline just flipped the room. Meryl's not the center anymore." And she wasn't. Karoline sat back, composed, her silver cross catching the spotlight. No longer a background symbol, but a quiet signature of strength. She hadn't just countered the insult, she had claimed the stage. The moderator cleared his throat, voice shaky. "Shall we move on to closing remarks?" But it was clear, the conversation had already changed. The moderator hesitated for a second longer, scanning the crowd as if unsure whether to move forward or let the room breathe. But Karoline had already taken control. Her words lingered like smoke in the air, thick with meaning, impossible to ignore. Meryl, ever the seasoned performer, adjusted her posture, folding her hands gently in her lap. The smile she wore now was thinner, measured. "You're eloquent. I'll give you that," she said, her tone smooth but a note of strain curling beneath. "But speaking well doesn't mean speaking wisely. There's danger in rhetoric, especially when it rallies more heat than light." Karoline didn't rush to respond. Instead, she looked directly at the audience, scanning the faces, some beaming, some uncertain, all waiting. "Heat," she repeated softly, then turned back to Meryl. "Sometimes heat is exactly what's needed to melt the ice around the truth." The crowd stirred. The metaphor struck deep. Karoline leaned forward slightly. "You said earlier that leadership is about lifting people up. I agree. But it starts by not looking down on them first." The audience murmured louder now, shifting energy in the room like a tide turning. Even the moderator glanced toward Meryl, almost expectantly. Meryl held her ground, but her shoulders tensed. "I never look down on anyone," she said, the edges of her words sharper now. "I've used my platform to speak up, for women, for children, for the marginalized. And that's noble," Karoline said quickly. "But when you dismiss a younger woman in front of millions for simply disagreeing with you, when you call her a little girl instead of engaging her ideas, that's not advocacy. That's hierarchy disguised as feminism." A quiet gasp spread through the audience. "I came here tonight not just to defend myself," Karoline added, "but to defend the millions of so-called little girls out there who are told to wait their turn, tone it down, or stay in line. I won't do any of that, and they shouldn't have to either." Silence gripped the room again, this time heavier than before. The moderator, sensing the weight of the moment, slowly nodded. "Powerful words, Miss Levitt. Miss Streep, would you like to respond?" Meryl looked at Karoline, this young, sharp, unshakable woman seated across from her. For the first time all night, her answer didn't come quickly. Instead, she reached for her glass of water, took a slow sip, and exhaled. "No," she said at last, her voice quieter. "Not yet." That silence spoke louder than any comeback. Karoline sat back again, her face composed but her eyes unwavering. She had done more than survive the confrontation. She had shifted the dynamic. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It had become a reckoning. "Would you like me to continue with?" The moment hung in the air like the final note of a symphony, vibrating, unresolved, but impossible to ignore. Meryl's silence, her simple "not yet," echoed more than any retort she could have crafted, and the audience felt it. The moderator glanced between the two women, unsure whether to intervene or allow the silence to settle deeper. But the room, for once, wasn't restless. It was riveted. Karoline adjusted the mic before her slightly, then turned not to Meryl, but to the audience. "You see, when someone with power pauses," she said gently, "when they hold their words instead of rushing to fill space, it tells you they're thinking. It tells you they're wrestling with what was just said." A few in the crowd nodded. Others simply stared. "Tonight wasn't about attacking," she continued, "though I knew that's how the headlines would frame it. I came to have a conversation, not just with Meryl, but with the people watching who are tired of being told experience equals wisdom and youth equals ignorance." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "I was raised to respect people, not titles. I've been underestimated in every room I've walked into since I was 19. I've been called unqualified, too ambitious, too opinionated, too loud, but I've also been right more times than I can count." There was quiet applause from the right side of the stage, then more from the back. Karoline's voice dropped just a little, personal now. "And let me tell you, being right while being young is one of the loneliest positions you can be in, because it forces others to confront truths they weren't ready for." The crowd grew louder now, some rising to their feet. Cameras flashed. Social media was already lighting up with hashtags. Across from her, Meryl still hadn't spoken, but her expression had softened. Something in Karoline's words had reached her, not just as an opponent, but as a woman, a leader, someone who'd once fought for her own voice in rooms full of judgment. The moderator leaned forward, his voice steady. "Miss Levitt, you've clearly struck a chord. Would you say you're trying to redefine what power looks like in this generation?" Karoline smiled, not smugly, but with quiet conviction. "I'm not trying to redefine power," she replied. "I'm trying to remind people who really owns it." The audience erupted. Applause rolled like thunder through the studio. It was no longer a contest of words. It was something more. A shift, a crack in the structure. And in that moment, Karoline Levitt stopped being the young press secretary on the defensive. She became the voice of a generation who'd had enough of being silenced. Backstage after the broadcast, the air buzzed with the energy of something extraordinary. Staff scrambled, producers whispered, and camera operators checked their feeds, already prepping clips for the evening news. But in the middle of it all stood Karoline Levitt, composed, but undeniably changed. She'd faced Meryl Streep, a cinematic icon, a cultural force, and walked away, not just unscathed, but victorious in a way few had ever witnessed. Not by shouting, not by personal attacks, but by commanding truth like a blade, precise, sharp, and controlled. Outside the CNN building, a small crowd had already gathered. Reporters with handheld mics shoved toward the velvet rope, shouting questions. "Karoline! Did you expect that reaction? Did you mean to silence Meryl? Are you considering running for office?" Karoline paused at the glass doors, her reflection staring back, her navy blue blazer immaculate, the silver cross on her collar catching the soft glow of the lights. The same cross that had once triggered a courtroom scandal was now a symbol of strength. She stepped out to the press line and held up a hand, not to wave, but to ask for silence. And to everyone's surprise, they listened. "I didn't come here to win," she said firmly, eyes locking with the closest camera. "I came here to remind America that truth doesn't have an age, and silence in the face of it doesn't make you wise. It makes you complicit." With that, she turned and walked past the reporters into the waiting black SUV. Phones buzzed instantly. Karoline Levitt quotes trended on X. One clip of her saying truth doesn't have an age was viewed 2 million times before midnight. Meanwhile, inside the studio, Meryl sat in her dressing room, staring into the mirror. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shaken. She was thoughtful. She was prepared, she murmured to her publicist. She wasn't playing for applause. She was playing for legacy. Back at the White House, Trump sat in the Oval Office, watching the footage on loop. "Get her in here," he told his aide. "Tomorrow." His voice held a rare tone, respect, genuine admiration. That night, as Karoline lay in bed, her phone lighting up with texts from governors, lawmakers, and conservative influencers, she realized something had shifted. No longer was she just a spokesperson. She was becoming a symbol of conviction, of youth, of unapologetic truth. She opened a message from a 19-year-old political science student. "You made me believe I can speak up. You made me believe I matter." Karoline smiled, eyes stinging slightly. This wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. The following morning, Washington, D.C. pulsed with a different rhythm. The air itself seemed sharper, more alert, as if the Capitol had just been jolted awake. Across networks, newspapers, and social media, Karoline Leavitt's name wasn't just a trending topic. It was a cultural lightning rod. At 8 a.m., Karoline entered the West Wing with a stride that seemed both effortless and authoritative. Staffers nodded, secretaries whispered. She headed straight into the Roosevelt Room, where President Trump waited, arms crossed, smirking like a man who already knew the outcome. "You did it," he said simply. "I haven't seen someone silence Meryl Streep since, well, never." Karoline gave a brief smile, but she didn't gloat. "I didn't silence her," she said. "I gave her the choice to speak up or step down. She chose silence." Trump nodded approvingly. "You're not just a mouthpiece anymore, Karoline. You're becoming the message." Meanwhile, inside Meryl's Upper West Side townhouse, the actress sat at her kitchen counter, tablet in hand, watching clips of last night's broadcast. She watched herself retreat, watched Karoline hold her ground, watched the world react. On a morning talk show, one liberal host tried to spin the narrative. Meryl showed grace under pressure. She didn't need to stoop. But another co-host interrupted. "Maybe. Or maybe she simply got out-argued. Let's not confuse poise with passivity." At that moment, a message popped up on Meryl's tablet. An open letter published in The Atlantic, titled, "The Night Karoline Leavitt Rewrote the Rules." It read, "What we saw last night was not just a debate. It was a seismic shift. Youth challenging legacy. Clarity eclipsing prestige. Karoline Leavitt walked into a lion's den and didn't roar," she reasoned. "And in doing so, she showed that in America, respect is earned not by status, but by courage." Meryl sat back, exhaled, and closed the tablet. That afternoon, Karoline met with the White House comms team to draft her statement. She didn't want it to gloat. She wanted it to remind. Her final quote read, "Last night wasn't about winning a war of words. It was about proving that anyone, regardless of age or background, can speak truth to power and make the room listen." The statement hit every major network by evening. That night, conservative rallies lit up with placards reading, "Karoline speaks for us." On X, the hashtag #Leavitt Effect trended globally. College students shared videos saying, "I used to be scared to speak in class. Not anymore." And at a cafe in Iowa, a middle-aged woman placed her hand on her daughters and said, "This is the kind of leader we've been waiting for." Karoline stood at her office window later that evening, watching the Capitol glow against the night. She didn't feel victorious. She felt responsible. Her phone buzzed. A message from Trump. "You're not just our future, Karoline. You're our now." She didn't reply. She simply looked at her reflection in the glass. The silver cross on her collar gleamed faintly, no longer just a symbol of faith. Now it was a signature of strength. The media storm didn't die down after the press conference. It surged. Karoline Leavitt's clash with Meryl Streep became more than a viral moment. It was now a symbol in America's culture war. Conservative voices heralded Karoline as the one who silenced Hollywood arrogance, while liberal commentators accused her of disrespecting an American icon. But Karoline didn't flinch. She expected the storm, and she was ready to ride it. That night, she sat in her White House office, alone except for the soft hum of a desk lamp. On her phone, a flood of emails and messages blinked. Praise from supporters, interview requests, angry critiques from celebrity outlets. Trump himself had called earlier, his voice booming with approval. "You didn't just stand your ground, you dominated. That's why I chose you." But something deeper stirred in Karoline. She scrolled through a thread titled Number Real America Speaks. One post caught her attention. A mother from Iowa, thanking her for defending traditional values in a world where Hollywood lectures us instead of listening. Another came from a retired veteran. "You said what we all feel but are too afraid to say." Karoline leaned back, letting those words wash over her. It wasn't just about Meryl. It was about the people, the forgotten ones, and she had become their voice. Suddenly, a call came in. It was from the governor of Texas. "Karoline," he said, "we're planning a town hall on free speech in media and entertainment. We want you to lead it." Her mind raced. A televised forum? Live debates? She was no longer just responding to conflict. She was shaping the narrative. The next day, she flew to Dallas. When she arrived at the packed venue, cameras clicked and reporters swarmed. "Ms. Levitt, what message do you have for the entertainment industry?" one shouted. She didn't stop walking, but replied clearly, "Art is powerful, but so is truth. And it's time truth got a microphone, too." Inside, she stepped onto the stage. A massive screen behind her lit up with the words, "Voices of the People, Truth versus Celebrity Power." As the lights dimmed and the audience hushed, Karoline adjusted the small cross on her collar and smiled. She was no longer just answering questions. She was asking them, and America was listening. As the event hall slowly emptied, the echoes of applause still hung in the air like a memory refusing to fade. Karoline Levitt stood near the stage, surrounded by a few reporters asking for statements. But she wasn't focused on the microphones or the flashing cameras anymore. Her eyes were on Meryl Streep, who now sat alone, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes heavy with the weight of an evening she thought she could control. Karoline took a slow breath and approached her, not with triumph, but with intention. There was no malice in her tone as she said, "You're one of the most celebrated women in America, Meryl. But even legends forget. They don't own the truth." Meryl looked up, lips pressed tightly, struggling to muster the composure she wore so confidently on stage just hours earlier. "I didn't expect that," she admitted, voice low. "That's the thing about expecting," Karoline replied gently. "It often blinds us to what's real. You saw me as a mouthpiece for a party. But I'm more than that. I'm a woman with convictions, a history, and a purpose." Around them, a few remaining audience members paused, subtly observing the exchange. The once fiery debate had cooled into something far more human. Two women, decades apart in age and experience, stood in the quiet aftermath of battle, no longer opponents, but figures in a deeper conversation. "I meant to challenge your policies," Meryl finally said. "Not your soul." Karoline offered a half-smile. "But you did both, and that's why I pushed back. We can fight about politics all day, but when we start mocking faith, experience, or the people we've never met, we're no longer arguing. We're diminishing each other." Meryl nodded slowly. "Maybe I needed to be reminded." Karoline extended her hand. "Then let this be the start, not the end." The actress looked at it, hesitated, and then took it. Cameras flashed again, capturing not a viral moment of conflict, but something rarer: resolution. Later that night, Karoline sat at her desk in the White House. The silver cross necklace she wore had become something of a symbol in the media. Some called it defiance, others called it hope. To Karoline, it was simply her compass. A message popped up on her screen, from the president. "You did it again, Karoline. You didn't just win a debate, you reminded the country why we fight, with strength and grace." She smiled. On her desk, a new framed quote stood beside her Bible. It was a line she had improvised on stage that night, now circulating online as a trending hashtag, "I don't need applause to be right. I just need the truth to stand." Outside her window, the city of Washington shimmered with late-night lights, alive with stories, struggles, and 1,000 voices trying to be heard. And somewhere in that vast noise, Karoline Levitt's voice had found its place. Not by shouting the loudest, but by speaking with courage when it mattered most. In a world where power often speaks loudest, Karoline Levitt reminded us that clarity, conviction, and courage still cut through the noise. She didn't walk onto that stage to impress a crowd or chase headlines. She stood her ground to defend truth, principle, and the dignity of civil discourse. Meryl may have thought she owned the spotlight, but Karoline proved that real leadership isn't about performance. It's about purpose. This wasn't just a clash between generations or ideologies. It was a moment that exposed what happens when confidence meets conscience. In the end, Karoline didn't just win the argument. She won the room. She won the silence. And she won the respect of those who know that integrity always outshines arrogance. Because sometimes, the youngest voice in the room speaks the oldest truth.